Good afternoon. How are you? We are continuing with part 2 of our devotion Bible study on Max Lucado, 6 hours one Friday. We're going to get to anchor point 2 here. Now, if you'll remember, anchoring deep or an anchor point is being able to make sure that we have a strong foundation that we're basing our life on and basing how we're living on. And the anchor point here is my failures are not fatal. That's important for us to understand that how forgiving God is very important to understand in order to anchor to Jesus in your life. And so this is what Max Lucado says about that. My failure is not fatal. It's not that he loves what you did, but he loves who you are. You are his. The one who has the right to condemn you provided the way to acquit you. You make mistakes. God doesn't. And he made you. I think that's absolutely beautiful. So where we're going here is we're going to go to chapter 9. And with chapter 9, the reason I selected this one, I thought was very, very good, is called Christo Redeemer. Christo Redeemer is the name of the chapter. And the reason that I picked this one is because, first of all, a place I've always wanted to go is Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And there's a 90-foot tall statue there called Christ the Redeemer, or in the language of Brazil, Cristo Redentor. 90 feet tall, says Max Lucado, 1,320 tons of reinforced Brazilian tile. Positioned on a mountain, 1.5 miles above sea level, it's the famous Christ the Redeemer statue that overlooks the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Now, no tourist comes to Rio without sneaking up Corcovado Mountain to see this looming monument. The head alone is 9 feet tall. The wingspan, fingertip to fingertip, 63 feet. Below me, says Max Lucado, is Rio, 7 million people swarming on the lush green mountains that crash into the bright blue Atlantic. Behind me was the Christ the Redeemer statue. As I looked at the towering edifice through my telephoto lens, 2 ironies caught my attention. I couldn't help but notice the blind eyes. Now, I know what you're thinking. All statues have blind eyes. Well, you're right, they do. But it's as if the sculptor of this statue intended the eyes to be blind. There were no pupils to suggest vision. There was no circles to suggest sight. There was only little orphan Annie openings. I lowered my camera to my waist. What kind of redeemer is this? Blind? Eyes fixated on the horizon, refusing to see the mass of people at its feet? I saw the second irony as I again raised my camera. I followed the features downward, past the strong nose, past the prominent chin. My focus came to rest on the cloak of the statue. And on the outside of the cloak, there is a heart, a Valentine's heart, a simple heart, a stone heart. The unintended symbolism staggered me. What kind of redeemer is this? Heart made of stone? Held together not with passion and love, but by concrete and mortar? What kind of redeemer is this? Blind eyes and a stony heart. Oh, some people would not admit to having a blind redeemer with a stone heart. But let's take a close look. For some, Jesus is a good luck charm. The rabbit's foot redeemer is what Max Lucado says of people like this. Pocket-sized, handy, easily packaged, easily understood, easily programmed. You could put his picture on your wallet, or you could stick it in your wallet as insurance. His specialty, getting you out of a jam. Need a parking place? Rub the redeemer. Need help on a quiz? Pull out the rabbit's foot. No need to have a relationship with him. But that's not the way it's supposed to be with Jesus. He should not be our rabbit's foot redeemer. For many, he's an Aladdin's lamp redeemer. New jobs, pink Cadillacs, new and improved spouses? No, he wrote that. I didn't say that. Your wish is his command. And there's a lot of people where prayer can come to a wish list. And especially at this time, we have to be careful that it's not all about our wishes. What about God's will? What about what Jesus wants for us? I think that's very important to consider. And the last one's a little dated, but very good nevertheless. The Monty Hall Redeemer. Remember the game show, Let's Make a Deal? Actually, Wayne Brady is the host of Let's Make a Deal now, so I could say that. The Wayne Brady Redeemer. All right, Jesus, let's make a deal. For 52 Sundays a year, I'll put on a costume, coat and tie, dress, hat and hose, and I'll endure any sermon you throw at me. In exchange, you give me the grace that appears behind door number 3. But that's not the way our relationship with Jesus is supposed to be. Now, compare the blind Christ that Max Lucado saw in Rio to the compassionate one seen by a frightened woman early one morning in Jerusalem. You might remember this story. A rooster crows his early morning recital. A dog barks to welcome the day. A peddler shuffles down the streets, his wares on his back, and a young carpenter speaks in the courtyard. Jesus sits surrounded by a horseshoe of listeners. Some nod their heads in agreement and open their hearts in obedience. They have accepted the teacher as their teacher and are learning to accept him as their Lord. Whether cautious or convinced, they listen keenly. They arose early. There was something about his words that was comforting, even more comforting than sleep. Now, we don't know what his topic was that morning, prayer, perhaps, or maybe kindness or anxiety. Some of you might be going through that now. But whatever it was soon interrupted when people burst into the courtyard. Determined, they erupt out on narrow street and they stomp toward Jesus. The listeners scramble to get out of the way. The mob is made up of the religious leaders, the elders and the deacons of their day, respected and important people, and struggling to keep her balance on the crest of this angry wave is a scantily clad woman. Only moments before, she had been in bed with a man who was not her husband. Was this how she made her living? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe her husband was gone. Her heart was lonely. The stranger's touch was warm. And before she knew it, she had done it. We don't know. We don't know about this woman. Curious neighbors struck their heads open with out the windows. Sleepy dogs yelled at the ruckus. And now, with holy strides, the mob storms toward the teacher. They throw the woman in his direction. We found this woman in bed with a man. The law says to stone her. What do you say? The woman searches the faces, hungry for a compassionate glance. She finds none. Instead, she sees accusation, squinty eyes, tight lips, gritted teeth, stares at sentence without seeing, cold, stony hearts that condemn without feeling. She looks down and she sees the rocks in her hands, the rocks of righteousness intended to stone the lust out of her. The men squeeze them so tightly that their fingertips are white. They squeeze them as if the rocks were the throat of this preacher. They hated Jesus, of course. What did Jesus do? Well, probably looked at her. And as he looked at her, did his mind race back? Did he relive the act of forming this child in heaven? Did he see her as he had originally made her, knitted together in her mother's womb? So with tenderness only a father can have, he set out to untie the knots, and repair the holes in this woman's life. He began by diverting the crowd's attention. He draws on the ground. It's always interesting to think about, what was he drawing? We really don't know. Everyone looked down. The woman feels relief as the eyes of the men look away from her. The accusers are persistent. Tell us, teacher, what do you want us to do with her? He could have asked why they didn't bring the man. The law indicted him as well, by the way. He could have asked why they were suddenly blowing the dust off an old command that had sat on the shelves for centuries. He didn't. He just raised his head and offered an invitation. I guess that if you've never made a mistake, then you have a right to stone this woman. Those who are without sin cast the first stone. He looked back down and he began to draw on the earth again. Gee, I wonder what he was drawing. Wonder what he was writing. Suddenly, rocks started to fall on the ground, and they walked away. Beginning with the grayest beard and ending with the blackest, they turned and left. They came as one, but they left one by one. Jesus told the woman to look up. Is there no one to condemn you? He smiled as he raised her head. She saw no one, only rocks, each one a miniature tombstone to mark the burial place of a man's arrogance. Is there no one to condemn you? He'd asked. Oh, there is still one who can, she thinks. And she turns to look at him. What she got, she never expected. She got a promise and a commission. The promise? Then neither do I condemn you. The commission, go and sin no more. See, it didn't stop there. It wasn't that he lets her off the hook. He simply says to her, you're forgiven. Go and sin no more. On that morning in Jerusalem, she saw Jesus and Jesus saw her. And could we somehow transport her to Rio de Janeiro and let her stare at the base of Cristo Redentor, Christ the Redeemer? I know what her response would be. That's not the Jesus I saw, she would say, and she would be right. For the Jesus she saw didn't have a hard heart, and the Jesus she saw didn't turn a blind eye. However, if we could somehow transport her to Calvary and let her stand at the base of the cross, you know what she would say? That's him. That's him. She would recognize those hands. The only hands that held no stones that day were his. And on this day, they still held no stones. She would recognize his voice. It's raspier and weaker, but the words he would say from that cross are the same. Father, forgive them. How could she ever forget those eyes, clear and tear-filled? Eyes that saw her not as she was, but as she was intended to be. May you realize that that's the way that Jesus looks at you. Tomorrow, part 3 of our study, Max Lucado, 6 Hours, One Friday. God bless.